So we have a Q&A, and we have a fun little microphone that Francis is helping us set up. And thank you, Francis, for the space.
Test.
There we are. So we can throw that thing around and ask some questions to our panel here.
Hi, Cube. Thank you so much for your talks. I'm definitely a commentator. I have a hard time with questions because I have insecurity issues, which is why I wanted to present a question about security. I think that we're doing empathy all wrong. So I wanted to pose a question to you. It deals with mirroring, it deals with understanding, it deals with characterizing and coloring. How do you find in your each practices where security shows up and where we understand security, and that's the entry to empathy?
Just to be clear, we're talking like security and safety, not information security like InfoSec and privacy.
Oh, well, they're totally related.
Okay.
So mirroring, you get a sense of security by the person that's leading you.
Yes.
Your boss is leading you. You look up to them. You feel safe in your job.
Yeah.
Your educators, they lead you, they teach you. You feel safe in your education.
Yeah.
Your country, your city has councilmen, has assemblymen, has elected officials, has presidency, has kingdom sovereignty.
Yep.
You look up to them
Yep.
because they protect you. Religion, again, guidance, belief, leader, they guide you, they protect you. So empathy could be raised as a measure of security. So what do you guys think about that? Thanks.
Cool. I think, A, I think it's a great question. B, I acknowledge you for stepping up and taking the cube first if it's not somewhere you like to go. So yeah. Do you want to start on mirroring and kind of set, and then I'll follow?
I think, a question I think we've talked about before preparing for our panel at EXPA relates to maybe the answer to this question, which is, how do you know you're doing empathy right? And I think that when you are, one of the ways in which you can be trying to do empathy and not doing it right, it would be, on that scale, sympathizing, judging from a distance. If I were you, this is what I would do. I think there is a natural, intuitive connection that actually, if you're in the empathetic space, it's a given that you have this feeling of collaborating and being with somebody. And so I think that sense of security actually comes from the experience of empathy itself. I think you kind of posed that maybe security is the entry point. I would say that that sense of security is almost like a validation that you're actually in the empathetic space. And if you don't feel secure, then the person attempting to give you empathy or your attempt to join with somebody else's need, you're not quite there yet.
I think there's also an aspect of what you talk about that can be seen in outcomes, right? So what you talked about in terms of security and trust, if I were to ask my team if we're doing empathy right, I know what a conversation looks like between two people where trust and security is happening effectively, right? Like you can say you don't like my design or I disagree with your approach, but it feels different from, you know what, I would have done it that way, right? So I think there's a sensibility that you see in the outcome of how your team performs and how they receive each other. I also think you can see it in your products, because pretty much you will find if you didn't really create that right understanding of your customer, your product is probably not serving them well. And one of the things I encourage you to look at is this video where I was talking with Chris Chandler. Yeah, Chris is everywhere. And he talked a little bit about what it looks like when a product fails. And if you've been there, I hope you have, because it's actually a very humbling moment, but it causes you to go deeper. So I think you could see, to your point, trust and security can be witnessed, and you know you're doing it right based on the outcomes that you see. There's one more thing that I was thinking about, like with doing it right, and I was very much moved by Anna's visuals, right? And if you were like me and you saw those animations, you're like, yes, I can learn to meditate. If that character can do it, I can. But the reason I thought that it was an outcome that was done right was then you saw that there was a clear understanding of that underlying, we are making things friendly, accessible, and then you did it in the photography. And they still, although they were completely different mediums, felt like they were from the same family. Did you kind of get that? And you knew as a customer, future, because you all have 3 months free, you knew that Anna and her team got you. That is a good outcome. Anyway, sorry.
I'm glad you thought that. It works, yay. Yeah, I mean, just going back to the whole trust and security thing, I think, obviously, like the role of the brand is so incredibly important, especially to Headspace, especially we deal with, we're teaching people meditation, and it's such a phenomenally hard thing to teach and to grasp and to understand. And, it's, again, it's, the mind is so unpredictable, and it's like, how do we offer a place that feels reliable and honest, sometimes unpredictable, something that reflects the manner of the mind. And it's a really challenging thing to do and to get right. And like the use of illustration as an example has just worked really well for us, and it continues to do so, and people really relate to it because it feels non-judgmental. And well, I hope it works. Seems to be working at the moment.
Yeah. Dave.
Yeah, I work as a brand consultant, and I love the world you've created. I'm always trying to get my clients to think in terms of worlds. Create a world and invite people to step into that world, and they'll understand you and you can understand them. So I wanted to ask, and I wrote it down because it's kind of complicated. So I've been astounded by how vulnerable my clients are willing to be with me, because as a brand consultant, I ask them deep, dark questions about who they are and what they care about. And when they feel safe, and when they know I'm listening, when they're allowed to be vulnerable, realizations surface. I feel outside the box here. Realizations surface and solutions can be discovered. So my question for you is not related to branding at all, but it's a broader question about how far does empathy go? And I'm going to make it real timely. This last week, we've seen so much outrage from the right and also from the left. Don't worry, it's not a political question. And it almost begs this question, which is, at what point do you stop having empathy and simply say this is no longer healthy or acceptable behavior? That is, does empathy bring with it a requirement of non-judgment? And how far can we go with non-judgment before we begin indulging unhealthy behaviors? How do we know where that line is?
Joey, you wrote a good blog.
In 2,200 words on my blog, I answered your question about the election.
You get 140 characters.
So I think the nature of empathy is actually you're really trying to inhabit the experience of the other person. So it's actually zero judgment, because judgment is your perspective. So if the goal is empathy, then when you're there, you're there. And so I don't think it's something that you kind of measure, like how far do we travel in empathy? It's a bit binary. You're either in your space or you're in their space. And from that perspective, that's why I think it's not really a question of how much judgment, how much do I add to it? Because again, the goal really is you're really trying to inhabit their experience. But that's not to say that, in some magical way, the reality is that one of the things about empathy is even though you're inhabiting somebody else's space, there's still a you. So, and I think that that's sort of the mysterious sort of way to think about what empathy is, which is not that different than mindfulness in many ways, which is, you're observing yourself. And so I think that that's, if you think about it as not a spectrum, but really two positions that you try to maintain when you're in a state of empathy. One position is I'm really trying to completely inhabit the other person's experience and to know it perfectly. And yet at the same time, I can, in my mindful space, observe it, think about it, analyze it.
I think for me, one of the core things about empathy, and I'll tell you, I had to dig deep. I was crushed the day after the election. And I literally had a crisis. I was like reading my feed. Thank God you did your post, because I had nothing. I literally, the things that were going through my head were not happy, empathetic burn at all. I was in distress. And I think when I spent some time, I'm like, okay, Bern, you're going to be talking about empathy. You better pull this out. A core thing that I realized was, and I think I knew this, just because I understand and I kind of get insight about your feelings doesn't mean I agree with you. And if you can put that down, you can have a conversation. And the election is extreme. The example I gave is extreme. But you could be out in the world having conversations with customers and not agree in their world perspective at all. But the way I know I'm not doing empathy in my world, as a little check, is if there's all this conversation like the little cars going through my head, you're crazy. What? I'm supposed to write that down? No way, right? Or more so, shock. And so if I'm really focused on you, I'm just going, wow, you feel that way, right? So I think that's one of my personal gauges. I do not have to agree with you. And there's also a time when you have to be honest with, this may not be the time for me to try to even jump that chasm to be empathetic with you, because I'm not ready. Like, I could have interviewed anybody on Wednesday, and it would have been a horrible, horrible day. Oh, yeah.
All right. One more question, guys, and then we can go to drinking, which some of you already started.
Joey, you had a slide from Angela Duckworth. Talent plus effort equals skill, plus effort equals accomplishment. So if you're deficient in empathy, what is that effort? What do you do? What if the people that aren't empathetic, they don't get it. What do they do to improve that empathy, or what is that effort?
I think we are hardwired for empathy, and so I think we all do it. I think sometimes we don't realize we do it, and I think that's part of it, which is that I think one of the things actually related to Angela Duckworth's work is that sometimes one of the limits regarding our personal growth is that we don't actually believe we're capable of personal growth. So the first idea is to get it out of the way that, what is false is that, any given human being, let's say, has an empathy limit based on their genetic predisposition for it. It is true that you can have a range, but at any moment in time, you can be more empathetic and you can grow in it. And so, like common examples of how you have empathy are related to like very simple things, like if you're watching a video on YouTube and somebody takes a bad fall and you're like, oh, that's the fact that you literally feel that is empathy. Though you're watching a movie and somebody's in a movie and they're sneaking through a dark house because it's a horror movie and you're feeling nervous and afraid, you're experiencing empathy. So all these sort of like common automatic emotional responses we have, that's empathy. So we have that. I think the challenge really when we're talking about developing empathy is the idea of, well, okay, that's great. How do I inhabit the experiences of people that I don't automatically see that I have anything in common with? And that is genuinely challenging. But I think, the real key is to kind of find something within you that might not be identical, but to kind of say, that does kind of remind me of something that I do feel, right? So you can say, let's say in a complex fashion, you can say, those people voted for him and I don't get that. But there's a part of you that says, but I think I do relate to this feeling in my life where it really, really sucks to be ignored. It really, really sucks to feel invisible. It really, really sucks for all these people to be talking about these priorities that I just don't relate to. And it really sucks for people to put labels on me that I don't think are true. And on that level, I can empathize because you found something within yourself. It's not quite the same, but it's essentially relatable. And then that's how you can build empathy. And so, because at the core, what we're talking about is developing the skill of perspective taking, but you want it to be, again, it's a feeling. It's not an intellectual exercise. So your personal reference point ought to be a personal feeling as well. Does that make sense?
I think there's also exercises, Joe, and we've talked about this, right, of things that get in the way of the empathy, right? Meditation, stilling your mind. So you're not in judgment, you're actually in the moment. Consuming experiences. I mean, if you're a designer or you're a creator of any flavor, you should be out trying to get as many experiences and emotions out of your body. Now, I'm not saying you all need to go out and do skydiving tomorrow, but the more you are engaging with the world, those experiences are going to be easier to draw into. And then there are just core methods to how you ask questions and how you can hold yourself. I mean, and some of these are kind of givens in research that will enable you to bridge that gap with the person. So there are some training skills, and we can post some resources around it. You got another one?
And actually, just to kind of, illustrate this, just not necessarily as the details, but anyone who had grown up with me, I grew up in a sort of a conservative Christian home. My parents came as immigrants, but I was born here. So the reality is, actually, for me, just personally, I had no psychological boxes in my head, really. My parents didn't teach them to me because of sort of my Asian culture. When I grew up in church, feeling bad feelings was like some spiritual deficit that I had. Everything was explained. So without going into the details of how I got here, I just want to just convince you that to answer your question as to how far a person can travel from being empathetically low talent is that you can end up giving a talk on empathy as an expert.
Thank you, guys. Thank you to everybody. Thank you to the panelists.